at BIGS, Business Institute for Business and Global Society, we study and focus on the most urgent areas where business impacts society. So issues like climate change, economic inequality, racial and gender equity. We actually just joined forces with our colleagues in the Race, Gender, and Equity Initiative, who are here in the room, to ramp up the work that we're doing there. And really just investigating what the changing purpose of the firm really is. We have a twin mission. The first is to build an intellectual hub on the study of business and society and around these topics at HBS, but also more broadly with academics and scholars who are really studying the new models of how business can address a lot of these societal challenges. And then the second part of that mission is to translate that research into action. So how do we break out of the academic journals and the ivory tower and really help practitioners and people on the ground who are implementing these solutions and addressing these challenges on a daily basis with the research that we have. So with that, I'm really proud to say that the Ownership Project is one of our flagship research projects here with BIGS. It really allows us to take a serious and research-driven look at alternative ownership structures and alternative ownership enterprises. These models, they challenge assumptions about who should own, who should benefit, and how businesses can really drive inclusive prosperity in society today. And it's about time that we're focusing on this issue here at HBS. You know, we're really known for our work on capital markets and leadership and innovation, but increasingly we know that we have to study ownership models. Because ownership shapes incentives, power, and outcomes. And so that's what we're here in this room to do today. We're bringing together a diverse group of people who are all passionate and interested about this topic. And we're going to bring everyone together into a shared conversation so that we can drive our understanding forward. So I know that many of you probably know each other, but some of you might not. So I just want to do a show of hands so that we get a sense of who's in the audience. Could you raise your hand if you are an academic studying this topic? All right, great. We're at a university, a lot of academics, that's good. Can you raise your hand if you're a funder or work in the funding ecosystem? All right, great, we have a few. Civil society representatives? Not here yet, maybe? All right, okay, there we go, we have one. Anyone in government or public policy? All right, excellent, a few. And then practitioners or business owners or employee owners. Excellent, wonderful. Well, good stuff. Well, it's really wonderful to have you all here. And we're really coming together at a time when wealth inequality in the United States and many other countries around the world has reached historic highs. So as of the end of 2024, 2/3 of the wealth in the country were owned by the top 10% of wealth holders, while the bottom 50% owned roughly 3%, just under 3%. That means that the average household in the top 10% holds 110 times the amount of wealth as the average household in the bottom 50%. Those are staggering numbers, but they're more than just numbers. They reflect really a systemic imbalance that threatens social cohesion, trust in institutions, trust in business, and really just challenges our notion of what a just and democratic society really is. At the same time, we're facing what some refer to as a silver tsunami. And Julie and I were talking earlier, if anybody has a better name for that, let us know. But over the next, decade, even less time, estimates vary, but it's between 1 million and roughly 3 million businesses that are owned by people at retirement age that need to transfer hands. And so there's this massive wealth transfer that's about to happen. And worker ownership is not the only solution to these problems, but it's a really key one and a really core one. And so we're excited to move that forward. So what are our goals for these next 2 days together? We have 3 primary ones that we'd like everybody to focus on. So the first is to map what these diverse ownership structures and diverse ownership models share and how they differ in ways that advance understanding, scholarship, and practice. The second is to surface critical research questions around firm performance, capital structures, legal frameworks, and the societal implications of worker ownership. And then the third is to really forge collaborations to turn this research into action. As I said at BIGS, one of our missions is to take research and implement it into action. And so we'll be doing this by creating videos of the conference today. We're filming video interviews in a separate room as well. We have a writer here who will turn this into a report that everyone can use after this day is over. But hopefully this will spur new research questions. It'll turn into cases for the MBA classroom, and our conversations here will educate the next generation of business leaders. So now some notes and some housekeeping. First, we are recording all of the sessions during the conference. While the focus will be on the front here, some of the audience will be captured. If you don't want to be on camera, sit in the back 2 rows, and really the back row to be safe, but the back 2 rows won't be on camera. So just let somebody know if you need to move and there's not an open seat. Second, during the conference, as I mentioned, we'll be filming short interviews with conference attendees in the room across the hall. These will be used on our social media channels to raise more awareness about worker ownership. And if it's something that you'd be interested in, just come and talk to one of the members of the team, and we'll see where we have open slots in the schedule. Also, if you see folks stepping out during sessions, they're not being rude. They're probably going over to do an interview. Third, as I mentioned, we have a writer, Cindy Perman. She's sitting right here. She's a veteran journalist, and she'll help us create a report documenting this wisdom. She's a member of our team, so I encourage you to chat with her on the side. She may have follow-up questions from things that you said or questions that you asked, but this is all with the goal of really democratizing this information and making sure more people learn about employee ownership. Now, before I close, I'd like to give a huge thank you to the individuals who have worked countless hours to make this happen. So we have Nien-hê, we had Ethan Ruin, Tony Guidati, Tony over here, Jaegu Lee, that's Jaegu, and then Sarah Gazaniga. Is Sarah in the room? Sarah's working at the table out there. So a big round of applause for all the wonderful like. Sorry? Sam and Emily. And Sam and Emily, of course. Yes. Thank you too. So if you see them throughout the day, just thank them and let them know how wonderful the conference is. And if you have comments or feedback or criticism, you can talk to Olivia in the back. Okay, now I ask you today to be candid, share not only what works, but also what doesn't work. And let's leave here better informed, start new conversations, and really drive the next generation of research and understanding on employee ownership. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tony Guidati, who will introduce our first panel.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you everyone for being here. This has been something that folks on our team, we've been talking about for a long time. Even before the ownership project existed, we were talking about how could we bring together all of these people, all these different research areas, not just the academics, but the people in the real world that are making these things happen, that are changing communities, that are building community wealth, that are giving new opportunities to individuals and families. And so we're really excited to welcome you all here, and we're really excited for the discussions that are going to happen, and then where those discussions take us, whether it's research, whether it's practice. So thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to introduce and announce our first panel. I'll be introducing our moderator, Brian Trelstad. Brian Trelstad is a senior lecturer in the General Management Unit and the director of the Advanced Leadership Institute. That's the part I've memorized. Following a career in impact investing, he now researches social entrepreneurship, systems change, impact investing, and the role of business in society. If you give it up for Brian Trelstad.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, from Nien-hê, the clicker. I don't have any slides. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here. As Tony said, I'm a faculty member here. I teach social entrepreneurship and systems change, and I lead the Advanced Leadership Initiative that Rosabeth founded 17 years ago. And common to both of those ventures is smart people asking questions that challenge the status quo, and then are equipped with the tools, whether they're graduating from the MBA program or this one-year fellowship, to ask questions and build new things. And nowhere is the status quo as entrenched as in this question of ownership, which is one of the reasons why we're having a conversation today with many people in the room who are quite expert in this topic. And it's as much a question for how much we can learn collectively as it is what we will share. I'm delighted to have a group of panelists that's run the spectrum from sort of theorists to practical academics to practitioners who will answer the questions of what is employee ownership and what we can do to accelerate it, assuming that that's something that should be accelerated. A theoretical foundations conversation after lunch is usually the death knell of the the food coma. So what we're going to do as run of show is going to have each of the panelists speak for about 10 minutes with some thoughts and their perspectives. If along the way there's a technical question, we're not going to have plenty of time for Q&A, but if there's a technical question, if somebody uses an acronym where I don't know what that is and I really can't continue to follow, raise your name card and we'll just stop for that technical question, but no speeches or questions along the way. I will then be paying attention and taking notes, and thank you, there we go, and lead us off with 4 or 5 questions that the panelists have all had. They'll come up front. But along the way, I'll be reading the room and see where the energy is. And so even though we got 20, 25 minutes for my questions, my guess is that your questions are better than my questions. So after the first 1 or 2, I'll be looking to pull you in. But we've got about 90 minutes for that. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Nien-hê, who is, I should do a quick introduction. I will introduce Nien-hê, who will be followed by Chris, who will be followed by Adria, followed by Evan, and I will introduce each of them up front. Nien-hê is the course head for leadership and corporate accountability, which is the first year business ethics class. I've had the privilege of teaching with Nien-hê in this course, which introduces a range of questions around not just shareholder capitalism, but stakeholder capitalism, of which employee ownership is one of the questions that we wrestle with. I had a chance to stumble into this topic, not only in my impact investing career, but through a case that we wrote on alternative forms of ownership presented by the Patagonia transaction to sell to a trust. So that's raised this issue certainly in Nien-hé's mind, and I'll turn it over to Nien-hê to lead us off.
Okay, great. Is this working, Tim? Yeah. So, Brian, thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. What I thought I would do is help set the stage for answering the question, what is employee ownership? By asking the question, why should we care about employee ownership? Because in a lot of ways, the answer to the question of what is employee ownership is going to reflect in part why is it that we care that employees have some kind of ownership stake in the firms in which they work. So if you put it another way, right, insofar as a given sort of form of ownership realizes certain values that we care about, we might say that qualifies as employee ownership. But on the other hand, if another model doesn't quite realize those values, we might say that's not employee ownership or worker ownership. So it might be helpful just to start out a little bit with why we might care in the first place that workers have some kind of ownership stake in the firms in which they work. And so for that, I'm going to take a small discussion around what I think is an evolution in the thinking among at least a large group of philosophers on the relevance of thinking about work and ownership from the perspective of political and moral philosophy. After that, thought it would be helpful to locate worker ownership in the context of what we do here in the business school and why it is that there's, I think, sort of a moment in some sense as to why worker ownership is sort of coming to the fore in the context of the business school. And then I want to close out with a few motivating questions for us here at the Ownership Project as to why we care about bringing this issue of employee ownership, worker ownership to the fore. So clearly there are many traditions in political philosophy, moral philosophy, that concern themselves with work and questions of ownership. The Marxist tradition, right, of which we have an expert in the room, needs no introduction in that sense. But from the perspective of many political and moral philosophers who work in the broadly sort of Anglo-American liberal egalitarian tradition, questions about work and questions about ownership have not been as prominent. I think the standard view or the traditional view has been something like, if we get the background conditions set up so that people have fair quality of opportunity, right, so that people have sort of the fair exercise of liberty, then what happens among economic agents, right, is more of a private matter as far as how work is arranged and how ownership is structured. But over time, I think that view has been complicated, and it's, I think, instructive to say a little bit about why that's the case and sort of what kinds of considerations have arisen as a way to sort of set the stage for our discussion over this next day and a half. So if we think about probably the preeminent liberal egalitarian, the person sort of on the one hand thinks about sort of there being basic rights and some degree of equality in terms of, say, social background and economic opportunity. John Rawls, who was here across the river, when he first came out with the theory of justice, right, in which he tries to understand and discuss what qualifies as a just economy, he had some discussion about the economy, but I think since then it became more prominent in his thinking. And I think there's sort of two reasons that we might think about that from our perspective that are helpful. The first is in thinking about the fact that from the perspective of economic arrangements, if contracts are incomplete, then even if we think about people sort of making various arrangements on their own up front, right, the outcomes of those arrangements may depend a lot on the balance of power that exists in those relationships. And so from the perspective of fairness, we might think a little bit about, well, how are the benefits and burdens of work and ownership shared, right, in the face of the need for discretion and in the face of incomplete contracts, right, where there is some kind of discretion as to what those outcomes are, independently of sort of the initial conditions in which people entered into those contracts. So I think so that's sort of one development, at least in the economic sphere, I think that sort of really pushed a lot of people to think about this question of the fairness of the distribution of benefits and burdens, right? Even if you have fairly well-defined background conditions and why that might matter in the context of how work is arranged and organized. And the second one is, I think, really pushing on the question of freedom or autonomy more generally. Here I want to highlight sort of three distinct ways in which people have talked about why we might want to have workers having an ownership stake in the context of firms where they work. So one idea is to, again, alluding back to the fact that firms involve discretion on the part of managers, given the nature of the need for that discretion to manage firms. And if exit options aren't perfect for workers, or if workers have invested in some sense their own human capital in ways that are firm specific, sort of specific to that firm, the opportunity for exit is costly. And so in that kind of context, just in order to protect themselves in a very basic kind of way with regard to what you might call sort of their basic rights and interests, that's one reason to care about why we might thinking of having workers having an ownership stake in the context of the firm, if that gives them, this case, a kind of control option in some kind of sense. A second option that people have argued for why we might care about sort of giving workers an ownership stake in the context of their work, also related to control, is from a broader view of freedom with regard to embracing some sort of self-development or some sort of self-cultivation, some idea of sort of autonomy in that broader sense. And then the third one is to say that, look, if there is an exercise of power in the context of the firm, in addition to sort of being able to have workers protect themselves with regard to their own basic rights, in addition to sort of thinking about their own autonomy and development, shouldn't we also care in some sense about the democratic exercise of power within the context of the firm? So those are sort of three reasons why we also might think, from the perspective of freedom, broadly understood, we might want to care about granting workers some kind of ownership stake in the context of the firm where they work. And so there, in addition to sort of the basic kind of efficiency reasons, right, we can think in terms of fairness considerations of benefits, or we can think in terms of freedom and the idea of sort of exercising some kind of control or governance in the context of the firm. So that all operates at a fairly high level. And oftentimes when we think about questions of efficiency, freedom, or fairness, we might think of the level of policy. So the question then is, why think about these issues in the context of the business school, where so much of our focus is on the decisions made by individual investors, individual managers, individual workers, owners, right? And thinking about the level of the firm itself. And one way I try to understand why this conversation is now happening in the context of the business school relates to sort of three trends, I think, that we've seen over time in the context of the business school area. So the first is, I think by now, the idea of stakeholder capitalism has taken hold in the context of the school as an alternative to shareholder primacy, or the idea that firms should be managed basically in the interest of their shareholders. But stakeholder capitalism ultimately takes you only so far, because it doesn't actually ask the question about who owns the firm. It's simply about how the firm is managed. And given how ownership structures can influence the management of firms, right, I think that's one reason talking about ownership structures is now essentially kind of a natural next step after thinking about stakeholder capitalism. The second one is in terms of thinking about, I think, the rise of entrepreneurship among many of our students, right? And with the rise of entrepreneurship, thinking about founders, right, and their responsibilities and roles. I think there's a lot more active discussion in that space for students as they think about trying to structure the ownership of their firms themselves. And that, I think, relates also to what Drew mentioned about the transition of ownerships who want to exit their firms, how they might do so in a way that allows it to continue its mission and operations in thinking about alternative kind of ownership structures. And then finally, I think the third reason is just sort of growing awareness. Brian mentioned the Patagonia case, but if you think about, for example, Novo Nordisk, the manufacturer of Ozempic, very successful company, but the controlling shares are held by a foundation whose mission is thinking about long-term health in society. And so in terms of thinking about these three spaces, the limits of stakeholder capitalism, entrepreneurship, right, and sort of greater awareness about new models, I think that's part of the reason we're also seeing this kind of discussion in the context of the business school. So at the Ownership Project, trying to navigate the space between sort of very high-level values and ideas and policies and sort of on-the-ground thinking about what we're trying to do in the space of worker ownership. And I want to leave you with sort of two sort of values that are sort of guiding our work in that space, which I hope sort of sits in between those two. One is the idea of trying to enhance what we call economic dignity, elevating everybody's status in the context of how they engage and act in the economy and participate. And the second one is economic pluralism. Is there a way to sort of enhance the range of ways in which we do business and organize business to give people sort of a broader selection of choice, but also to envision a thriving variety of ways of doing things in the context of the economy? So with that, thank you very much. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion and our time together here over the next day and a half. Thank you.
Thank you, Nien-hê. Next up is Chris Mackin, who all roads in this topic lead to Chris. About a decade ago at Bridges Fund Management, we were looking at a firm which was going through a generation of transition, and employee ownership was on the table. And it was a smaller company, and after a series of who should I talk to about this, all roads led to. So I went to Chris's office in Harvard Square, and we talked about it. And we recognized the challenges, the transaction costs, the small scale, the exit of equity into the company when you need debt. And so it became clear to us that it was not the fight that we could wage with that particular business opportunity. But Chris, I know, has long straddled academia and practice. He is the founder of Ownership Associates and a partner in American Working Capital Fund that's been raised to invest in worker ownership transitions. He's also an academic, serving as a senior fellow at the Rutgers Institute for Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, and as a faculty member of the Harvard Trade Union program at the Harvard Law School. So without any further ado, please welcome Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon.
So let's see. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody, for putting this together. This is a lot of fun for me. I live on JFK Street, right across the bridge, and my office is next to the Harvard Square Post Office. So if anybody needs stamps, or if anybody needs to use the bathroom at Harvard Square, I'm the guy to talk to. I actually, just a little bit of background. I came to town, and this is for Roosevelt, I came to town in 1974 and did my doctorate with Lawrence Kohlberg, and wrote a thesis, and he was over at the Graduate School of Education. And the start of my career, I was doing democratic schools. So I was trying to figure out how to bring the idea of democracy to the educational environments. And this being a sort of a rich and interesting town, in terms full of people with good ideas, I was meeting historians and economists and philosophers, many of whom were interested in the economy and how we could make for a more democratic and inclusive economy, how we could be candid about the failures of socialism, and do something about making capitalism more fair and inclusive. And that sounded good to me. And so I talked my professor into letting me write a thesis called The Social Psychology of Ownership back in 1984. And looking around for somebody who would have some idea of what I was doing in writing this thesis, I turned to Professor Joseph Blasi in the back, who had got his doctorate from the same school 2 years prior. And Joseph has been a treasured friend and colleague ever since, who recruited me to join his institute back in 2011. So it's great to see everybody here, and that's just a little bit about me. So that was it. Oh, now we have, these are Adria's slides.
We will.
Still shapes they work, so it seems.
I only have a few.
That's okay. You just go through them? That's through them. That's fine.
There we go.
There we go. That's fine. Okay, here we go. So my task today is to try to help make some distinctions and to sort of wade gently into the world of actually trying to define employee ownership. Anybody who tries to define this idea has got to be careful. And in fact, and be humble, that there really is no one answer to what is employee ownership, what is worker ownership. It's hopefully helpful to present some alternative ways of looking at this. And I've done some thinking about that and writing about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about types of employee ownership and get into definitions, dig in a little bit more on definitions at a theoretical level, talking about ownership, property, and membership. Talk about the employee ownership paradox, which I will tell you right now, how the heck can workers who don't have any money be owners in a significant way of capitalism? That is a preview of the paradox, and we'll speak to that. And then finally, a particular kind of hobby of mine that it's great to be living around here is that right next door, 98 years ago, a gentleman by the name of Owen D. Young gave a dedication speech for the opening of Baker Library. And his words, as you'll see at the end of the talk, set this up perfectly here today. He was old enough, this was time enough, that he could look at literally the beginnings of the emergence of industrial capitalism. I'm giving you a little preview. And the sense that we got from him is that we've actually started off in the wrong foot, that we've given too much precedence, as Owen Young said, to capital and not enough to managers and workers. We've allowed managers and workers were working for capital when capital should be a resource that's working for managers and workers. And he proposed, standing on the newly laid steps of Baker Library, that the Harvard Business School would be a place that could sort out how to do that. Now here we are, 97 years later. Things move slowly at Harvard, but it's great that we're here. And we have a centennial coming up into 2027, so maybe we could have another meeting. Okay, so let's talk about structures. And here, I'm not going to pretend to be the statistician. My friends, Corey Rosen and Joseph, will give you much more in terms of facts and figures, but just to give you a little bit of a sense of the waterfront. The main structures in use in the employee ownership world are employee stock ownership plans. Russell Long, senator from Louisiana, passed this legislation first in 1974 with several amendments in the 80s to make this happen. And statistically, it is the largest structure of what we're talking about. Employee ownership trusts, which are much more prevalent in the UK, but have made an appearance here recently in the United States, and it's a welcome appearance. They're much less frequent. There are about 40 of them. There are 6,500 ESOPs. One of those EOTs in terms of employment, this is just the numbers of people involved, is a Hobby Lobby, is an EOT structure. There are others we could get into, but 6,500 ESOPs with 15 million workers, 40 EOTs with 60,000 workers. I'm going to leave it to Joseph and Corey to tell us the numbers around employee stock options, which are obviously very well-known, particularly in the Silicon Valley and the venture world. Restricted stock units, our friend Pete Stavros at KKR or at Ownership Works makes use of that structure very productively. And then last but not least, our worker-owned cooperatives, which the latest statistics I've heard on that, there are about 751 of them that employ about 7,000 workers. So if that's a sort of a spectrum of structures, how about we weighed in on the relationship of those structures to two dimensions here. One being corporate governance and the second being economic participation. And this is just a sort of collection of ideas that I had about salient questions about under corporate governance. What do these different structures have to say about voice, about the board of directors, corporate governance representation, about shop floor representation, and last but not least, what kind of power do employees have when it's potentially time to sell? The big voice questions. Economic participation practices. The first one for me is capital appreciation, is being able to share in wealth, the wealth of capitalism. The second dimension is profit sharing, which is is an income sharing, it is not wealth sharing. A economic participation practice issue that we need to look at is longevity. Is the employee ownership structure that we're talking about for one cohort of employees, or is it potentially for multiple cohorts? And then there's a question of investment risk versus equity grants. Are workers being asked to actually put their money in? Are they paying for it in some form or fashion, or is that financing being taken care of in another way? So, in terms of if we sort of map out the structures and those sorts of questions, this is just one person's opinion about where we stand. And I wrestled a little bit with what to call this, or what I'm calling practices as opposed to laws and regulations, okay? There's a relationship, there's a sort of a close relationship. And in fact, much of the law around this is permissive. You can do more than is stated in the law. You could be more democratic, for example, in ESOPs than you have to. But there's a distinction here between practices and laws that is worth paying attention to. So in terms of ESOPs, the questions of voice at the board level, I've got a tiny check there because and Corey and others will be able to tell you, there's been a sort of an evolving discussion about that, about how employees should vote for boards of directors, how they might be represented on boards, should they be represented directly by being elected from their peers, should they, and this is my bias, should they have a voice in being able to appoint people who are pre-qualified with the relevant skills, pick from 3 accountants, 3 lawyers, and 3 engineers, the workers, so sort of an indirect form of representation. This is very much a sort of a cutting edge, evolving question about how to get workers involved at that high level of corporate governance, which I happen to think is very important. At the shop floor, there is a lot of evidence and a lot of data that it helps distinguish successful ESOPs from less successful ones when workers are not just being given a share of stock, but are actually invited to make decisions around the work itself. You'll hear more about that. And in terms of a voice around sale, well, there is something legal and regulatory about that, which is important. If an ESOP company is being sold as an asset sale, there is a pass-through vote to workers and who are vested in the ESOP. If it's a stock sale, then not. Okay, I'm moving very quickly here. I just saw that. So much for talking about coming and visiting me at the office. So there are these different sorts of structures, and under economic practices, I would just sort of make the distinction in terms of longevity, which is key. ESOPs are multi-generational, and there's some question about how much the stock option, the RSU versions, are multi-generational. Only a couple of them involve actually out-of-pocket investments. Generally, they're not. And last but not least, there's a paper on all of this where I sort of wade in and make the point that these are different ways people talk about ownership, but are really quite different. And so it's good to sort of clarify, are you talking about compensation? Are you talking about investment? Are you talking about retirement plan or membership? And this foreground, background. The problem is that it's ships passing in the night. People are often talking about what they think ownership is, and it's different from what's really going on. And so there's more here in terms of what to do, but we'll talk some other time. But I have to show you, well, there's a bill that is going to be providing capital to do this, which is a new development as of last week. It has not been passed. It's been introduced into the Congress. It will provide credit enhancement for managers and employees to buy companies, addressing that question of how can this the employee ownership paradox, how does that happen? So stay tuned on that. And then finally, here's this fellow, Owen Young, who next door, 98 years ago, said, into these large-scale businesses, we brought together larger amounts of capital and larger numbers of workers that existed in cities once thought great. We've been put to it, however, to discover the true principles which should govern their relations. From one point of view, they were partners in a common enterprise. From another, they were enemies fighting for the spoils of their common achievement. I hope the day may come when these great business organizations will truly belong to the men who are giving their lives and their efforts to them, I care not in what capacity. Then we shall dispose once and for all of the charge of the industry organizations autocratic and not democratic. Then we shall have no hired men. And he thought that objective may be a long way off, but it is worthy to engage the research and efforts of the Harvard School of Business. 3 years later, he was on the cover of Time magazine. He's a fellow I think we all get to know once again. And that's it. Thank you very much. You do have that.
But I need the clicker.
Get the slides back up. So thank you very much for that, Chris. Next up is Adria Scharf, who is the Senior Associate Director of the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, where she also serves as Director of the Applied Research Laboratory and the Director of the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership. She is a faculty member at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. Welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to be with you. I'm Adria Scharf. I'm part of the leadership team at the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, where our faculty have been producing research and supporting research to advance the understanding of all forms of employee ownership over many, many years. It's incredible to be here, and I am just delighted and congratulate the Harvard team at Biggs for the ownership project and its launch. This work is really important, and these conversations are not ones that I had ever really anticipated having here at HBS, and it's very exciting. So this morning's session is on theoretical foundations, but I wanted to kind of take a more grounded approach to that question. And rather than starting from kind of abstract theory, what I really want to do is share a couple of sets of conceptual insights, sort of pieces of theory, that I have derived from my own kind of close observation of the data. So my own close observation over many years of interviewing and surveying and studying worker-owned / employee-owned businesses and how they operate and workers' experiences within them. And just want to kind of open to acknowledge the terminological diversity. Chris Mackin shared out about some of the kind of structural models and employee ownership in the United States. And just to acknowledge, like, we all use different terms. This is a very mixed room. Some people talk about worker ownership. Some people talk about employee share ownership. Other people use the language of broad-based equity compensation. And these different terms, they do have different connotations. They do have different origins and histories and different conversations in communities. And they sometimes do kind of infer different roles for the worker specifically. Different degrees of worker power, different degrees of worker voice. So just acknowledging sort of that diversity, and just underscoring kind of the shared conceptual common ground of the common foundation among all of these different concepts, this kind of lexicon of terms is the fact, obviously, that employee ownership, worker ownership is a set of arrangements. It's a big kind of set of umbrella terms for the whole variety of arrangements by which the workers, those who contribute labor to the enterprise, are sharing ownership, sharing an actual material equity stake in the business where they work. And to kind of echo Nien-hé's opening when he said, it's not just about like how a company is managed. Employee ownership is not just about treating workers well. It's not just about management. It means the workers have an actual equity stake that is material. And this is important because ownership, right, confers broad buckets of rights. In our capitalist economy, ownership confers very broadly rights to financial return, the right to benefit financially from one's ownership stake. And secondly, ownership often confers governance rights. And this varies tremendously among actual forms of employee ownership, empirically on the ground, as Chris kind of alluded to, the degree, for example, of governance rights that a worker might have in a worker cooperative, or even in a democratic ESOP, as opposed to an ESPP or a less democratic ESOP. There's a tremendous amount of variation, and the degree to which worker owners have governance rights, it's really defined and constrained by statute in particular, as well as by individual organizational plan design. So this is important because, employee ownership, worker ownership really is extending to workers some of the kind of rewards and rights that are typically associated with ownership that are typically in our economy enjoyed by investors of capital. So kind of the default prevalent model in our economy is that it's investors of capital, people who put in capital at risk, that have the rights associated with worker ownership models extend some of those rights to the workers themselves, which has all sorts of implications both for internal firm dynamics and for kind of the macro distributions of reward in the economy. So now I'm getting to what I really wanted to tell you all, which is I wanted to just share with you a couple of kind of sets of insights, I would say that are again derived from my many interviews and surveys that I have done with a variety of different types of employee-owned businesses, which is to say, and I guess I'll sort of preface this by saying that when I started doing in-depth interviews with successful employee-owned businesses, I was repeatedly struck by this kind of like pattern of surprise where it seemed, for me as an outside researcher, talking to a leader of a business, it seemed like they were describing decisions to me that totally defied economic logic. So I often would hear stories from the CEOs of companies about why they chose not to immediately lay off their workers, despite the fact that all of their competitors were laying off workers, for example, at the beginning of the COVID downturn. Other similar examples like that, where sort of like at arm's length on paper, it almost seemed as if these decision makers in the C-suite were kind of defying economic logic, or at least sort of narrowly construed cost-benefit logic. Wrong button. Hold on.
If we just escape out, but here we should be good. There you go.
Thank you. So interviewing folks in the C-suite and very successful employee-owned companies, and I'm generalizing here. You know how in our field sometimes we're talking about like the purest, most democratic models and kind of like the vision for a society that we hope we can build in the future. Other times we're talking about actual lived, like robust models that are sort of existing and thriving in competitive markets. These examples I'm sharing here are the latter. Like I'm talking about kind of mainstream businesses that are succeeding in competitive markets that have continued to generate profit for year over year, if not decade after decade. And hearing the leaders talk, I often noticed several different features of their decision-making. There's a long time horizon quality to the decision-making, where they articulate the importance of long-term rather than short-term value creation, and weighing the long-term value creation over the kind of short-term costs and the short-term gains. There's a definite sense of the employees in these employee-owned companies being seen to some extent as stakeholders. So they're not just cost centers, but they're clearly viewed as stakeholders and as assets whose active cooperation needs to be cultivated and protected and rewarded. And trust preservation ends up just being very important. I find that again and again in talking to leaders of ESOP companies, especially successful ESOP companies, there's this kind of intentionality around the deliberate preservation of workforce trust. It's as if the leaders recognize this trust that they've invested in and built up, the workforce trust, as a key organizational asset. And they may prioritize that even when there are short-term costs to doing so. So just a couple of quick examples of this sort of logic. I'm thinking of a company which is one of the oldest ESOP companies in the country. It's a manufacturing firm with multiple sites, headquartered in the Mid-Atlantic. And they had, the leader was describing to me that they had this like quandary, which is that their New England facility had aged. It had aged almost beyond repair. And the leadership in this ESOP, 100% ESOP firm, with a lot of blue collar workers who were accumulating large retirement accounts through their ESOP, they had a decision to make about what to do with this. And the C-suite kind of sat together and kind of mapped it all out. And on paper, literally, it was crystal clear that the smartest thing that they should do should be to close down the New England plant and relocate operations to the Gulf Coast. And it wasn't just that like labor costs were cheaper, construction costs were cheaper. It was like their customers were all around the Gulf Coast. Like the shipping times would be reduced. I mean, the upsides of moving to the Gulf Coast and shutting down the New England facility were many. And I was really struck when this leader shared with me that in the end, they decided not to shut down and move to the Gulf Coast. They thought about the hundreds of blue-collar, long-time ESOP workers, the fact that they had invested so much into building this kind of culture of trust, and they thought through kind of the costs culturally, and this of that, and the way that would be perceived as a betrayal. And this company leader made the decision with his team to basically build a new facility down the road from the old aging plant in Rhode Island, and they're happy, and it worked. It was they continue to thrive, and it was smart in their long-term, sort of their longer-term calculus. So I won't go into detail, but you see hints of this same kind of logic with the COVID data. Some of you may be familiar with we at Rutgers did a big survey of ESOP companies during the COVID pandemic and the initial kind of downturn, and found that ESOPs during the COVID-19 downturn were 3 to 4 times more likely to retain non-manager and manager employees. I did a bunch of interviews with ESOP companies in late 2020, interviewing leadership, where I got to kind of really unpack the black box of what was happening in the C-suite. And very similar to this, again and again, I had company leaders within ESOP companies reflecting back on March of 2020, talking about how like everyone else was just all their competitors were sloughing off their payrolls. I'm not sure if that's a word. And how they like really held on as long as they could, retain workers as long as they possibly could. When some of them finally had to lay people off, they then hired them back. I heard a lot of stories about kind of shared cost cutting. Some did a day without pay, or like suspended 401k contributions, et cetera. So to kind of preserve that trust. 1 minute left. Okay, jumping forward. So that kind of, and to me, all of that kind of points to, it suggests a kind of different foundational kind of decision-making model or logic within kind of high trust employee-owned companies. The second kind of insight I just wanted to share has to do with pre-distribution, right? Then we all know that employee ownership models can pre-distribute wealth and profits. Workers are sharing in the profits and wealth they help to generate. The data has been replicated multiple times using a lot of different data sets and measures. I myself have done studies of a lot of different worker-owned companies that employ lower wage workers, showing just the power of even a relatively modest amount of wealth that can accumulate through a worker ownership structure can be incredibly meaningful in the context of our kind of grotesque wealth inequality and the fact that so many workers have so few opportunities to accumulate a nest egg of security. And just to note that it does depend on again, this is like real world. The ability of a company to share wealth and profits with the workers fundamentally depends on the underlying success of the business itself. It's the performance that creates the value to be distributed. So I wanted to just, these are a couple quotes from workers in ESOPs. And just in my 15-second close here, to say, I think from my close reading and my many interviews and studies, I think, a shared ownership, employee ownership structure can provide the architecture potentially for a different mode of profit seeking. And one that is in particular in contrast to kind of the private equity workers cost center logic, the stock market's firm, stock market kind of short-termism, and even employee-owned privately held businesses stand even in contrast to the kind of private ownership structures we often see in family-owned businesses or traditional closely held firms where ownership and the benefits and rights of ownership are still restricted into the hands of a few. And a shout out to Corey Rosen for his book called Ownership: Reinventing Companies, Capitalism, Who Owns What, which talks about that in much detail. And in closing, echoing what others have said, what Drew Keller said at the beginning, just to say that we at this political and economic moment have an urgent need for new paradigms, an urgent need for models that actually provide a strong economic foothold and a foothold of dignity for the broad working class and the middle class. And, and we have here the potential of worker ownership models that do exist. Their design does matter, their implementation does matter. And at our new applied research lab, we are making an attempt to really document and lift up some of the more democratic models and some of the models that allocate shares more equitably than others do, as another contribution to this conversation. Thank you.
Final speaker is Evan Edwards, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Project Equity, a nonprofit organization that helps businesses transition to employer ownership, securing liquidity and a fair sale price for the owner while helping employees build equity and a solid career path. So please join me in welcoming Evan.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to thank the folks at the BIGS program for the invitation and also for the kindness of the 12 o'clock start time. I think all of us coming from the West Coast appreciate that. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge an alum of Harvard and a co-founder of Project Equity, Allison Lingain, who is here. Allison, if you raise your hand. She appointed me CEO almost 4 years ago, providing me the opportunity to lead the great work that Project Equity does and build upon the foundation she and her co-founder, Hillary at Bell, created. Allison is now founder of another great organization, Ownership Capital Lab, and you'll hear her tomorrow. But thank you again, Allison, for the opportunity. I want to do a couple things here. I come from a private sector background and moved into employee ownership some 8 years ago. And though I come with certain values, which is why I love this work, other folks that come from my private sector background typically have some biases around who can be an owner, who can be considered an owner and of assets, of businesses, whatever the case might be. And so, one, I want to talk about my experience because I'm the type of person who needs to, not me personally, but those who come from my sector traditionally, might need some convincing. The other thing I want to do is I want to share about our work at Project Equity because the scope of our work reflects the levers that I think we need to pull in order to normalize employee ownership, in order for it to be a part of the accepted M&A culture, if you will. So my introduction to employee ownership was as a stock option holder in my first real job at a tech firm. I was introduced to the founders of a company called QuarterDeck. It's a software company in Santa Monica, California. we developed memory management technology, which helped early version of Microsoft Windows. If y'all remember early versions of Windows, they used to crash all the time if you open more than 3 windows. Well, we created the technology that basically allowed Microsoft Windows to operate efficiently. We called it optimization. I was one of the first 15 employees in that business. We grew to a peak of about 1,000 headcount worldwide and about 150 million in revenue. One of the unexpected components of my compensation was a stock option grant. At the time, I was familiar with that form of equity participation, but I assumed it was only available to the C-suite. I was about 22 years old at the time. Now, the founders of Quarterdeck, they were unique in that they distributed equity to the entire workforce. This included the married couple that provided housekeeping to the firm who, after our IPO, started a larger service where they cleaned offices throughout the west side of Los Angeles. My job in international business development initially had me representing our products to European software resellers. So I did a lot of phone calls, visited a lot of trade shows. I'm going to date myself a little bit here. I fulfilled a lot of orders that came in over the fax machine. I recently had to explain to a younger relative what a fax machine was. It was a really humbling experience. But within a half year, I was dispatched to Dunleary, Ireland, as part of a team that stood up our European production and sales operations. My work took me through Europe and Asia and other parts of the world. And as the business grew and my responsibilities grew and the valuation grew, my attachment to the work and my commitment to it and the pride in the company and my pride in that company were all elevated. I'll never forget how ownership culture, which we talk about in employee ownership all the time, ownership culture permeated that company and how tremendously fulfilling a workplace it was. So I may have mentioned we had an IPO 3 years into my tenure. That was a life-changing event for me and influenced my career going forward, and importantly, my perspective on the importance of workforce equity ownership. The reason that I work in the employee ownership field now is because of those experiences. Now, I know my prior career in the tech space is not necessarily a one-to-one equivalent to the mission of employee ownership as many of us see it, but at the most fundamental level, I understood then, as I do now, that if employees have an ownership stake in a business, all the stakeholders in that business stand to benefit. We see it in our work. And I imagine by extension what it could mean for the economy and maybe society as a whole if workers held more equity in their places of work. I'm going to share with you, these are some of the businesses, workers, and business owners that we have impacted through our work at Project Equity. I've been doing this work for 8 years now, the last 3.5 as CEO. Our work transitioning businesses from their legacy owners to their workforces is more powerful and extensive with each year. Last year, we performed consultations with upwards of 200 business owners and impacted the lives of hundreds of workers through our programs. Towards our mission to scale and normalize employee ownership, we engaged over 2,300 business advisors with our employee ownership learning content. We advise economic development leaders and policymakers in major localities such as Los Angeles, St. Paul, Minnesota, represented here, Mackin, and Chicago. At our Employee Ownership Equity Summit, we hosted 150 ecosystem guests representing public and private sectors from around the country. We produced and are airing a broadcast quality television commercial for employee ownership in 4 metropolitan markets right now. And we grew our capital funds, again, stood up by Allison, to $14 million, providing us with greater capacity to underwrite transactions. Our work is transformative. It provides workers a quality job, a business ownership stake, a pathway to wealth building, and so much more. You know, Adria mentioned some of her research and some of the discussions she's had with business owners and workers. I love hearing from the folks we've impacted who, as a for instance, are able to afford making a down payment on a home in Los Angeles or the Bay Area because they now receive profit sharing. I love hearing about the mother of four who, as a worker owner, has voice and agency and now has her say in her work schedule, which allows her to plan for childcare and other life circumstances. Most recent story I have from the field, I spoke at the holiday party of one of our client companies, and one of the guys on the job site crew says to me, you know, we made a decision on our own, we the job site crew, to not drive certain trucks, certain older trucks, because they're fuel inefficient and they break down all the time. And these guys now understand, again, ownership culture manifesting, that impacts the bottom line and impacts their profit sharing, right? So when I talk about ownership culture benefiting all of the stakeholders of the business, all the shareholders of the business, it's because the workers have an understanding of how it is that productivity and the actions that they take in operations are impacting the bottom line. One of the reasons I love our work is because it moves the needle on that bias I referred to. We expand the vision of who can be a business owner. In addition to helping workers achieve economic resiliency, we see them gain that voice and agency I spoke to. Many of them grow as leaders and move beyond the bias that they had, their own bias that they had about their ability to lead a business. I'll close with a bit of data for you all. BizBuySell, PrivSource, and Axial are three major platforms that list small to middle market businesses for sale. In the aggregate, they will list 90,000 to 100,000 privately held businesses this year. These listings generally do not include a significant number of businesses whose transitions are handled privately through a broker, an investment banker, or an advisor. According to Pew, 20% of these businesses have workforces of 10 or more. That's important because it's particularly challenging to transition a business with fewer than 10 employees. So at a minimum, the addressable market for an employee ownership transition in 2025 is 18,000 to 20,000 businesses. And with a reasonable assumption, employing anywhere from 250,000 to 500,000 or more workers. So given what I and others have said about shared ownership models and how incredible they can be, think about it, the impact on the US economy if the majority of this addressable market on an annual basis transition to an employee-owned business model. With that, I'll close. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
I'll invite the four speakers to sit up front because we're going to do a Q&A. And I'm going to stand and I'm going to keep my eye on questions that you guys might have. I've got a long list of questions that I shared with them in advance, and I have questions that I wrote down as I heard common themes emerge. And I'm going to ask them to keep their answers to the questions short, and I will wander close to folks if they are not being short. But we heard this, okay, there's lots of definitions, contested ideas about different models. Chris, you laid out different frameworks, but I'd like to get a sense from each of you whether or not worker ownership, employee ownership, economically without governance is employee ownership. So we talked about the different pieces of it, but is it fair to say that what's in scope for what you would describe as employee ownership would just be economic participation without governance? Just quick hits. Or how would you answer that question? We can get the mics, but I think that's mostly for the recording. I think if you speak loudly, everyone can try. All right. Is that right, Tim? Are we good? Okay. Excellent. So.
Well, I think we're going to hear from Corey and Joseph, and they're going to give us some hard data on this. But there does appear to be a real discriminant in terms of least shop floor level participation boosts the productivity and the performance characteristics of this in a remarkably large way. There's some sort of an increment just if it's a purely financial reward sharing game and you don't talk about it, but with the participation it matters a lot.
But you're answering that by saying the definition is it's more successful if you have it. Yes, but you're not excluding non-governance, okay?
No, in fact, I think there's we'll hear from the experts, but there's a marginal increase just if it's purely financial. Okay. But there's a premium if you actually open up with doors of voice.
Adria, great.
Because I think it comes back again to the kind of material distribution of equity. I think to me, there are levels or gradations, but to me, yes, it is significant and it is employee ownership when workers have an actual right to the financial share, to a share of their profit and assets. Much of my work has been about promoting the more, educating about and lifting up models that go well beyond that floor. But to me, if we have a definitional floor, my colleague Joseph Blasi wrote a book, The Citizen Share, and it comes back, I think, to that question of the share. Is a share being shared with the workers?
Got it. And by using the word material, you are almost implying a governance element, because if there's a material owner of a firm, they've got to have some information rights, some
You're making a good
suspicion.
that is true. Even in yes, you're making information rights, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
My experience, our experience is that once a business is transitioned to worker ownership, and we primarily transition businesses to co-ops and employee ownership trusts, once that definition has been conferred on the workforce, whether they sit on the board and are actually participating in governance or not, they consider themselves owners because, as Adria said, because they're receiving profit sharing, which is something that they were not was not available to them previously. So I think workers themselves would see themselves as owners even without that role in governance.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. So when I first started doing this work, I would have said the answer to your question is no. Without significant governance, I would not think of it as worker ownership. But over time, I've actually come to change my mind. And that sort of reflects, I think, the values that we're sort of looking for in that kind of context. And so I actually would now answer yes.
And what was the pivotal argument in that shift for you,
So I think a lot of the emphasis, I think, initially was around the question of, okay, if we think of the standard employment model where an individual sort of basically comes to work, they are engaged in working with other people, and then there's a manager or an employer, and they're sort of paid a wage for that time. I think when I first started out in this book, a lot of my concern was with the question of, well, what's that relationship between the individual as an employee and the firm in which they work? And I think I had a very narrow conception of what that relationship would be like. And spending time in the field with many people, we understand that actually that relationship can be quite varied in all sorts of forms. And in some sense, the many kind of concerns we might have about that sort of very stark view of that relationship don't manifest themselves in lots of firms. So then where is the concern with regard to that relationship? And for me, it increasingly, I think, really goes to your point, Evan, about thinking about our biases about who can be an owner. And for me, a lot of this actually really comes back to one's status in society. And I think there's a certain kind of status that's accorded to owners, I think, in our society. But for me, that became the more operative kind of concern, and it's less now about the governance in the context of that individual relationship. So,
Just one more.
She's got all of that.
No, it's just, I situate your question in the context of the current kind of reality, which is that the predominant models of business ownership in our economy concentrate wealth in the hands of a relative few and or give the rights of ownership and the benefits of profit to outside investors. As of, to me, it comes back to, again, that flow of the rights of ownership, the flow of the rights of financial reward. and the importance of building out more economically inclusive models of business that share those rewards more broadly. That said, we're working from a very low bar in terms of the status quo. And so we're talking about establishing a definitional floor of what we consider employee ownership. Above and beyond that floor, we need a tremendous flourishing of more democratic and more participatory models. And so that work is important too.
Yeah. So I'm going to start looking for a question. I've got a couple more, and I've got actually a long list, and I'll close with one question. But lots of amazing stories of folks who, as you said, Adria, defy logic in making decisions, very compelling evidence. But there's also a number of oversight mechanics of employee ownership that are premised on the fact that there's deep information asymmetry, that an owner, if they sell to an employee stock owner pool, gets a tremendous tax advantage. And so a lot of the friction that is built in is kind of predicated on the fact that you've got owners who are essentially trying to sell off this leveraged buyout to employees who may not know how to manage this. So is that premise right, and that the regulatory kind of infrastructure in the United States presumes that we need to have the government checking to make sure the owners aren't taking over a business on sort of false pretenses? And what are the things that might be promised in this new legislation, Chris, that address some of those transaction costs, which have made it an infinitesimally small? We added up all the numbers, excluding the RSUs and the sort of tech base. It's less than 10,000 firms, and Evan's suggesting we might double or triple it. But what will it take for that kind of policy changes to enable these transactions to happen?
Okay, well, first of all, you're right. We are, I think, 0.1% of M&A activity is owners selling to their employees. And not only is that challenging, the owners generally have to complete the transaction themselves with a seller note, because the workers are not going to be able to come up with the equity. You can finance with senior debt any number of good, profitable companies that are for sale. But if you're going to take advantage of this, there are tax incentives that are bringing the owners to the table. But that same owner, if he or she wants an efficient full sale, are going to have to be the banker as well. So this is why our bill, the AORA bill, the American Ownership and Sustainability Act, is going to be providing credit enhancement to private equity funds, to existing ones, and to sponsored new ones that will be able to write that check that conventional private equity can write in order to be fully competitive. Now, your point about the information asymmetry, let's be really clear. Most of these 7,000 ESOPs that are done were not done because the workers knocked on the door and said, "We want to buy the firm." They are being done over people's heads, and and people learn over time. And you can see that there's a certain kind of natural justice to it. People think, well, we didn't pay for this, but wait a minute, this is actually kind of right.
Yeah.
We should be the owners here. And so it's a matter of then filling in all the educational and informational activity to make ownership something more than just a paper transaction, but to be able to help people feel and think like owners.
Yeah. Any other responses from folks in the panel before I see if there are questions? I don't know. Next. Questions, please.
Your hands up.
That's all right. I'll call on people. I see hands. Put them down until we get this question done, and then I'll come to you. Quick question, no statements, unless you want to come up and join. There's a chair. I invite you up if you pontificate, please. Raphael.
So one of the traditional arguments that's made against in ownership is that labor doesn't have the excess capital. And now you're tying, the rule of investing is diversify. Here now you have your labor and your capital tied to the firm. The firm goes bust. So this is a traditional knock on the scheme. I wonder if there's any way which you can retort.
So portfolio theory is, of course, it is going to say that workers shouldn't invest in companies where they also work. That's a little bit, in this case, like a farmer being told that they should have a diverse set of crops, but they've only got 100 acres that they're working on in the first place. American workers are like that farmer. They don't have any assets at all, and so while it's a noble idea to to suggest diversification, and it is something that's listened to by this field. And that because ESOP firms are more likely to have supplemental 401k plans, because this message has gotten out. It is a good message. However, the comparison that we need to keep in mind is that most companies have no 401k or no ESOP. So there's no diversification whatsoever. People are just living on their paychecks. So it's a good point, but it's one that the field, at least the ESOP field, takes very seriously. And the best practices are required to have more than one retirement plan. Ideally, you should have a DB plan on top of the 401k plan, but you often can't afford that.
Well, there was, yeah, just actually, you do the thing. Yeah, you barely, yeah. But there we go. We should. Please, Jules.
I'm the mic guy.
Adria, wait till the music.
It's a really important question. I agree with my colleague Chris's thoughts, and just wanted to add this from sort of conversations with workers and conversations with kind of supervisory management, specifically in ESOPs, because I share that concern. And it's interesting. So a few features of ESOPs are important to bear in mind. One is that typically the employees are not paying anything for the ESOP shares. So whereas with a 401k, they're having to set aside a portion of their pay, hopefully going to match. The other, so the company is typically absorbing the cost. So wanted to just jump to a quick story, which is I did a series of interviews at a auto repair chain based in Toledo, Ohio, where the owner was sharing with the seller who sold this company to his workers was sharing to me how he had always offered a 401k, but the mechanics, like their pay level wasn't sufficient or they didn't value, the deferred benefit enough to set aside anything. So they offered 401k. There was very low enrollment in the 401k. And it was only when you established the ESOP, the other feature of an ESOP, in addition to being paid for by the company, is that it's like an automatic enrollment. Like you just get added and you start getting a statement. So there's no active choice there. And so it was just interesting to hear that for all those reasons, even individuals with their 401k were participating, they finally started to accumulate assets, to Chris's point, once they had the ESOP. That said, best practice 100% is to always have an ESOP on top of both a strong base wage and a diversified second plan.
And I would also add that in businesses with younger workforces, oftentimes the younger workforce doesn't see the value of the ESOP. It's out in the future. So also building in that profit sharing component. So you have three levels. You have the profit sharing, you have the traditional 401k, and you have the ESOP. That's sort of the golden idea.
You are.
Yeah. I have a question for Nien-hê, and in particular regarding the remark you made about how ownership is distinctively crucial part of social status. I was wondering whether this is a remark that stems from the fact that you live in the US. Because for those of us coming from Europe, where a sizable chunk of the population never owns a car because they use public transportation, never owns a house because they just rent one, never own a stock on the company they work for, it might be less crucial part of their stakeholder. So this is a question for you, but perhaps the others have something.
No, I think that's right. I think there is something psychological, emotional, social with regard to this idea of ownership in the context of the United States, which I think makes it an interesting space in which to have this conversation. I don't think necessarily extends elsewhere. I used to not think that. I think there was something about ownership in the sense that it was important either from, say, for example, a kind of way to defend. So I used to think that ownership was, in some sense, some private property, let's say, was important for individuals to be able to have a sphere of independence or to be able to sort of defend themselves against certain incursions by the state or things like this. So we can talk about like that idea. Sure, on a Republican theory of citizenship, that was important in that sense. But I don't think it's required as a guarantee of that in any kind of way. And so that's why I've sort of focused more on this idea of status, and that's why it matters, I think, it's much more socially dependent in a way that's different from, I think, other kinds of sort of more autonomy-based views on the importance of ownership.
I'd offer that our identity in this country is so driven by ownership. The number one wealth building mechanism is home ownership, right? And after that, business ownership, right? And that's the way we were taught to think very early on. So our identities are shaped by the concept of ownership.
I also think the other American piece, speaking as an American, is I think we're having this conversation as Americans abroad in the context of a society where there's not a robust kind of collective ownership, socialized ownership, shared ownership kind of baseline safety net. And so the importance of having a private little nest egg takes on this particular cadence, and it's actually a question of fundamental survival. I'll never forget, I was at a conference in Oxford, England, talking about employee ownership with some folks from Denmark, who are also part of the worker ownership movement, but had such a different perspective coming from a society where they're building employee ownership on top of this kind of solid social foundation. So yes.
Well, I need to emphasize perhaps the secret sauce of why we're even able to be here, at least those of us from the ESOP world, employee stock ownership world, is that this is a completely bipartisan issue in the United States. The Republicans have view this as worker self-reliance, workers being less dependent upon government. They like worker capitalism. Bernie Sanders thinks it's democratic socialism. I don't care what you call it, as long as you do it. And it is a signal strength of this idea that you could come at it from different ideological and historical traditions.
One last thing to add, it doesn't have to just be individual ownership too. I think there's also a very strong tradition of ownership, say, at the communal level as well. So I think that also features into it, but it's something that basically operates not at the level of sort of government, if that makes sense. So I think that's also builds into this tradition too.
One last comment. At Rutgers, we have a global network of scholarly fellows doing work on questions of worker ownership from all around the world, from lots of different cultures. And there are different versions of this conversations, but they're each kind of situated within our own cultural and statutory situation. But there is a global conversation to be had.
There's a question up here, Mark.
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the distinction between governance and shop floor democracy, right? So, because those are things that happen at very different levels. On the one hand, governance is sort of the big picture, right? But it doesn't necessarily impact people's lives on a day-to-day basis, whereas shop floor democracy is something that people would be engaged in on a regular level, but then could be overridden by decisions from above. So if you can speak a little bit to that question in terms of employee ownership, because, for example, ESOPs generally don't involve much in the way of governance rights for employees, but may have more shop floor involvement. So
let's see. I think that you made the point, Mark, that you could get something interesting going on the shop floor and then have it later overruled upstairs. And so this is why it's an issue that's not going to go away. And it's a complicated issue, but I think at the heart of it, need to recognize we've got a division of labor in our workplaces, in our society. There are people who are more expert, who are on boards of directors because they've negotiated loans with banks, they know the technology, they know the engineering. There needs to be expertise at the board level. And as I mentioned quickly in my remarks, I say that isn't necessarily an obstacle. I think over time, we will hopefully, with these kinds of companies, lessen the space of the division of labor. More workers will know more. But until we get there, it's a perfectly good idea, as far as I'm concerned, to have workers to be able to have some part of the nomination process or interview prospective board members who have the necessary expertise. Workers aren't necessarily the best engineers, but they're great judges of character. And who's going to be able to sort of dialogue with them about their company going forward, so they feel represented at that highest level. I think that's one of the cutting edge issues, that this field is dealing with. I mean, Most of the focus is on shop floor stuff, but there's a sense that it's an incomplete thing and that you can get overruled if you're not taking care of the corporate governance questions, and that's something I think we're working on.
Question back? Yeah. Just question about how do you think about the opposite of worker ownership? What is the opposite of worker ownership, and do you have a theoretical way of talking about it? I find it's often very complicated because you could say sort of standard ownership, but we don't really want it to just be the standard ownership. You could talk about it as private ownership. That doesn't also sound right. How do each of you think about the opposite of employee ownership?
Yeah.
So I don't think I said this in my remarks, but for me, I think one way to think about it is actually not at the ownership part. To actually start at understanding what the relationship is between the worker and the firm. So the opposite of worker ownership would be something like your sort of standard, traditional textbook economic model of wage labor or employment at will. You're hired to come in, exercise your effort and talents and skills in the context of work while being under the direction of a manager or employer, and basically be paid a wage or a salary for that. I mean, that would that's basically non-employee ownership. Does that make sense? And then once you start to involve the worker, right, in some form of equity ownership, then that basically I think is a way. We can build in on the traditional model. You can add in something about there's outside ownership that basically could sell the company and things like that. But that's kind of where I would start in thinking about and that's why I think the question of what counts as worker ownership that becomes actually quite broad.
Can I just, knowing that you teach the case where we discuss employee versus contractor, are you suggesting that a contractor model is one of employee ownership because as an Uber driver, I have autonomy and agency over my employment? Whether that's a fair contractual relationship, small firm to bigger firm, is fair or not? Did you go down that path?
So I go down that path. I think that's exactly why there's a debate about whether Uber drivers should be classified as employees or independent contractors with regard to how important they are for the business, how much discretion and control they have, because the more they look like employees, then it's precisely not the case of worker ownership in that sort of self-employed kind of way.
Yeah. Ethan.
So a few of you have talked about how nebulous the definition of worker, or broad the definition of worker ownership is. And I'm curious to your thoughts on how, it creates impediments to understanding efficacy and outcomes of worker ownership. Have you had thoughts on how to overcome those impediments, how to broader conclusions, given that worker ownership can mean so many different things?
Oh man,
sorry. I think we have to be having these discussions. Basically, I'm sorry, I can't do much better than that. Except my effort in that paper, defining employee ownership 4 meanings and 2 models, is to paint the broad spectrum of what's going on, and then we need to sort of find our way forward. And there should be a kind of a contest of ideas, a friendly contest of ideas. I had all those checkboxes. I mean, what criteria do you want to solve? I prefer that ownership be multi-generational, not be a lucky cohort situation.
And maybe that's a better way to ask it. How do we find commonalities across these different, which you started talking to, Chris, right?
Yeah, by putting them all out there and having these kinds of discussions.
And be clear.
You're here.
Oh, thank you. You're top. And just being very explicit and clear about the organizational architecture and the plan design, both across types, from the CHI kind of type model to a traditional ESOP to worker cooperative, kind of getting into the granularity of both in terms of how are rewards distributed, how does the ownership structure potentially impact C-suite decision making, kind of time horizons, and governance, et cetera. Yeah.
Do you want to pick up quickly?
Yeah, I was just going to offer from where I sit in working with many businesses every week, I see that there's sort of 4 layers or 4 definitions of ownership. One is, as a worker, do you have access to profits? Are you a shareholder in any regard? can you participate in operational decision making, not governance level, but operational decision making? And that's some of that shop floor negotiation that goes on, right? Oftentimes, that's more important to ops than anything that some supervisor is expressing, because the frontline workers know how stuff gets done, right? And then the fourth is the governance layer. And, you know, I would say don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Insofar as it's lovely if workers can have all four. We call that the gold standard at Project iFleet. But if we can achieve a couple of them, right, start to move the needle, because we're going to find businesses, right, amongst those 18 to 20,000 I mentioned that are addressable market, where you'll have business owners that we identify as completely mission aligned, and they'll want that for their workforce. And then there's going to be last dollar focus that whatever, you know, if we can nibble at the edges of one of those areas. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but I see ownership in those sort of four buckets.
Time for one more question. Gerardo.
Yeah. the base of employee ownership, the various forms, I see this aspect of giving the workers a voice and giving them the right to benefits as well. Now, there was another type of organization called labor unions that used to receive giving voice. What's the current, how do you see, is there an interaction, or labor unions are more of a same of the past?
I on the faculty of the Harvard Trade Union program, and I teach about this, and it may be interesting for people to know that the original labor movement vision was worker ownership. It was not collective bargaining. The Knights of Labor, the National Labor Union in the late 19th century, were people who were reacting to the arrival of European-funded industrialization and the brand new employer-employee relationship, and where people were being asked to work for a wage and be an employee. And people at that time in those early unions said, wait a minute, aren't you the same people we just beat up in a revolution and sent back across the sea? Now you're coming with your money and you're building these factories and telling us we're going to work for you for a wage. They said, no thanks, we're going to start our own companies. Now, how did that work? It actually worked pretty well for about a generation or so. But then workers did not have the reserves of capital to be able to reinvest in the next generation of the sewing machine that was coming out. And over time, these worker cooperatives, they were worker cooperatives that were started in the 19th century. There's all sorts of great history that's been written about this, went under the waves because feudalism had provided our European rivals with plenty of capital to be able to compete. So there was the resources it's a challenge for workers to be able to do this. But in terms of your question, Gerardo, I mean, this is an idea. This isn't an idea that just came from Russell Long or came from people in this room. People have been puzzling over property and what's right and how things should be owned for a very long time. And it's a question of recognizing what do we have here. We've got these complicated divisions of labor in terms of expertise, and we've got this complicated economic inequality, and what we do know, and what our bill is trying to address, is that workers don't have the money to buy companies, and soldiers coming back from World War II didn't have the money to buy homes. Farmers coming out of different crises didn't have the money to farm. The federal government, and this is what we're doing with this bill, said, okay, we're going to provide credit enhancement to private financial groups to help workers and managers be able to buy their companies. That's the precedent, and it's a recognition that workers don't have the money to do it, but we need to recruit the sophisticated financial community, the private equity community, people who know how to assess strengths and weaknesses of companies, and to be able to have this as an alternative to get from 0.1% of M&A activity to something much more significant.
Well, we're at time, and I'm gonna pose the question to the panel as a rhetorical one, as a summary. Nien-hê opened this by talking about the shift in thinking from shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism. And one of the unintended consequences, perhaps, of shareholder primacy is the wealth inequality, which is manifest in a lot of democratic capital societies. And so the question I would just pose for us to think about is, one, is stakeholder capitalism possible without material employee ownership? And two, what might be the unintended consequences of going from 1/10 of 1% to a more material percentage of the economy that is worker-owned? And I think it's our opportunity to begin to discuss that over the next couple of days and beyond as the ownership project kicks off with this conference. But please join me in thanking our panelists. All right. Thanks.